Hey guys, tonight let's do something very ambitious and very low effort at the same time. Let's slowly drift back into an America that existed before passwords, before notifications, before anyone ever said the phrase, "I'll just Google it." So go ahead and dim the lights. Put your phone face down. Maybe lower the volume just enough that you're not sure if I'm still talking, but you are. Because tonight, we're floating into America before modern life. An America that moved at the speed of paper, smoke, footsteps, and patience. An America where silence was normal, boredom was unavoidable, and no one expected to be entertained every 5 seconds. And of course, this doesn't mean America was peaceful or wise or emotionally healthy. It just means it didn't glow in your pocket. So let's start gently. No dates thrown at your face, no dramatic music cues, just a slow walk through a world that now feels almost fictional. Before modern life, America woke up quietly, painfully quietly. Morning didn't arrive with an alarm curated by an algorithm. It arrived with sunlight, or roosters, or factory whistles, or a neighbor slamming a door because walls were thin and privacy was optional. People didn't wake up and check the world, they woke up inside it. News did not refresh, it waited. If you wanted to know what happened yesterday, you waited for a newspaper, a physical object made of paper that someone else touched. And when you opened it, that was it. No comment section, no updates, no breaking news banner screaming that everything is collapsing again. Just ink, static, confident ink. And of course, it was already outdated, but nobody seemed particularly bothered by that. People accepted that information arrived late, sometimes days late, sometimes weeks late if you lived far enough from anything important, which most people did. This meant panic moved slowly, rumors took effort, and outrage had to travel by word of mouth, which immediately filtered out anyone who got tired halfway through explaining it. Honestly, a very effective system. Before modern life, time felt wider. Not longer, just looser. A single errand could take half a day, and no one felt robbed. You walked, you waited, you talked to people you didn't particularly like, and while that sounds exhausting, it did something interesting. It forced human interaction to happen whether you were emotionally prepared or not. There was no escape hatch, no headphones, no texting someone else while nodding politely. If someone talked to you, that was your whole afternoon now. This is why people develop the skill of small talk, a skill we have now collectively decided to abandon. Before modern life, Americans knew the weather intimately, not because they checked an app, but because it physically affected their survival. Rain meant mud, mud meant delay, delay meant lost money. Cold meant real cold, the kind that seeped into walls and bones and arguments. Heat meant sweat, smells, and an aggressive fly population that felt personally offended by your existence. And no one said, "This weather is inconvenient." They said, "Well, this is happening now." Acceptance was baked into daily life. Before modern life, boredom was not considered a problem. It was just a condition. People stared out windows for long stretches. They sat on porches doing absolutely nothing, which today would look like some kind of minimalist performance art. Children invented games with sticks, dirt, and mild disappointment. Adults reread the same newspaper, then read it again, then argued about it. Entertainment required either effort or imagination, sometimes both. And because of that, everything felt slower, but also heavier. Moments had weight because there were fewer of them competing for attention. Before modern life, Americans were very comfortable with silence. Uncomfortable things still happened in silence: grief, illness, regret. But there was no constant background noise to drown it out.
which meant feelings had space, too much space sometimes. People processed emotions by walking, working, praying, or just sitting with them until they dulled naturally. There was no immediate distraction therapy, no endless scroll to numb the edges. And so emotional endurance was higher, but emotional literacy was questionable. People felt deeply, they just didn't always talk about it. Before modern life, work was physical, repetitive, and very honest about hating you back. Factories were loud, farms were relentless, offices existed, but they smelled of paper, sweat, and authority. There was no pretending work was part of your identity journey. It was just work. You did it, it exhausted you, you went home. And if you hated your job, that was not a personality trait. It was just normal. Before modern life, Americans measured success in very tangible ways: land, house size, number of children who survived. Success was visible, sometimes aggressively visible. If someone had money, you knew it. If someone didn't, you really knew it. There were few illusions, few filters, few curated versions of life. Your neighbors saw you every day, at your best and worst. And if you reinvented yourself, it required physically leaving town, which people did, frequently and dramatically. Before modern life, trust worked differently. You trusted institutions because there weren't that many of them. You trusted neighbors because you had to. You trusted doctors even when they were wrong, which they often were. And when trust broke, it broke slowly, over years, not overnight. Before modern life, America told stories out loud. Family histories were spoken, not archived, exaggerated, softened, edited for dignity. Someone's great-grandfather was always complicated, which usually meant deeply unpleasant, but dead long enough to be forgiven. Memory was fragile, and so history was fluid. Before modern life, children grew up faster and slower at the same time. They worked early, understood responsibility young, but they also lived in smaller worlds, geographically, mentally. Many never left their hometown, never needed to. The world was what you could reach by foot, train, or rumor. And that limitation shaped imagination in very specific ways. Before modern life, America was obsessed with progress, but progress moved at a pace that allowed people to argue about it for decades before anything actually changed. New inventions were met with suspicion, then excitement, then disappointment. And everyone assumed the future would be better, but not immediately. There was patience baked into optimism. Before modern life, nights were darker, literally. Darkness meant something. It wasn't aesthetic, it wasn't cozy, it was quiet and unknown. People slept more, not better, just more, because there was nothing else to do. And in that darkness, America rested, not peacefully, but collectively. No glowing screens, no late-night doom spirals, no sense that something important was happening somewhere else without you. Just the knowledge that tomorrow would arrive, whether you were ready or not. And slowly, very slowly, that world began to crack. Not explode, crack. With wires and engines and systems that promised convenience in exchange for patience, then demanded more. But we'll drift into that transformation gently. No rush. For now, just stay here, in the quiet America. The pre-modern one, where life wasn't easier, just slower about reminding you how hard it could be.
Part 2. When distance still meant something. Before modern life fully stretched its limbs across the continent, distance was not symbolic, it was physical, heavy, inconvenient. If someone moved away, they didn't fade from your life, they vanished. Not dramatically, not tragically, just quietly. You might exchange letters for a while,
handwritten ones, carefully folded, carried by strangers on trains who did not care about your feelings. And then, one day, the letters stopped. Not because of a fight, not because of closure, just because life filled the space where effort used to be. And that was normal. Before modern life, relationships existed within physical limits. You loved who you could reach. You argued with who lived nearby. You married who was available and socially acceptable, which explains a lot. America before modern life was a country stitched together by railroads, dirt roads, and patience. Travel was an event. People dressed for it, planned for it, recovered from it. A trip across states wasn't casual. It was a story you told afterward. And because travel was hard, regions developed personalities, strong ones, stubborn ones. The South was not just warmer, it felt slower. The Northeast was not just older, it remembered more. The Midwest was wide and quiet and deeply suspicious of unnecessary excitement. And the West was unfinished. Before modern life, the idea of a national culture was more aspiration than reality. America was many Americas, loosely agreeing to be one country. News traveled, but accents stayed. Customs stayed. Grudges stayed. Before modern life, reputation mattered more than opinion. If people thought poorly of you, it wasn't an online inconvenience, it was a daily experience. You saw it in looks, in silence, in invitations that never came. There was no rebrand button, no curated comeback arc. Social consequences were long, slow, and deeply uncomfortable, which meant people behaved, not better, just more carefully. Before modern life, loneliness felt different. You could be lonely in a crowd, lonely in a family, lonely in a marriage that had quietly expired years earlier, but you were rarely alone. Someone was always nearby, watching, listening, judging quietly. Privacy was scarce. Solitude was intentional. And if you wanted to disappear for a while, you walked or worked or sat somewhere no one expected conversation. Before modern life, Americans trusted routine more than inspiration. Days repeated, weeks blurred, and in that repetition, people found comfort. Modern life tells us repetition is stagnation. Back then, it was stability. You knew what tomorrow looked like, mostly. And that predictability softened anxiety, even when life was objectively harder. Before modern life, money was physical. You held it, lost it, counted it twice. Debt was personal, public, sometimes humiliating. You owed people you knew, and they remembered. There were no invisible numbers floating in databases, just ledgers and memory, which meant financial mistakes lingered. Before modern life, America believed deeply in progress, but progress was uneven. Electricity came in patches. Running water followed slowly. Indoor plumbing felt like a miracle, not an expectation. And people adapted gradually. They didn't wake up one morning transformed. They layered new habits on top of old ones, which is why you could find homes with electric lights but still heated by coal. Modernity arrived politely at first. Before modern life, health was a negotiation. Doctors were respected, feared, and frequently wrong. Medicine was blunt. Advice was inconsistent. People accepted illness as a regular visitor, sometimes temporary, sometimes permanent. And because there were fewer interventions, people learned to live with conditions instead of fighting them endlessly. Pain was tolerated. Fatigue was normal. There was less obsession with optimization. You didn't fix yourself, you managed. Before modern life, death was closer, not sensational, just present. People died at home, families saw it, children understood it earlier. Grief was not hidden away in sanitized spaces, it was folded into daily life. And while that sounds heavy, it gave death a place, not an interruption, just a certainty. Before modern life, Americans were deeply ritualistic. Sunday routines, holiday traditions, seasonal habits. These rhythms anchored people. Time wasn't something you conquered, it was something you moved with. Before modern life, silence was not suspicious. If someone didn't reply, it meant they were busy, or asleep, or simply unavailable. No one panicked. Silence did not mean rejection. It meant life was happening elsewhere. Before modern life, entertainment was communal. You watched things together, listened together, reacted together. Laughter happened at the same time, so did boredom. And boredom was allowed to exist without apology. Before modern life, America told itself stories about simplicity. Not because life was simple, but because complexity wasn't yet overwhelming. Problems were visible, local. You knew who to blame, or at least who to yell at. Now problems are abstract, global, algorithmic. But back then, if something went wrong, it had a face. Before modern life, authority was tangible. The boss, the sheriff, the priest, the principal. You saw them, you knew them, and power felt smaller because it lived in human bodies. Before modern life, patience was learned early. Waiting rooms, lines, delays. Nothing happened instantly, and so expectations were calibrated accordingly. No one expected speed, they expected eventuality. Before modern life, America existed in a long inhale, holding, preparing, building quietly, unaware of how loud it was about to become. And as technology crept closer, as wires stretched further, as engines hummed louder, that inhale grew tense. But for now, the country was still breathing slowly, still grounded in physical space, still anchored to place, still living in a world where distance mattered and time waited for you to catch up.
Part 3. When news had weight, and waiting was a skill. Before modern life really settled in, information carried weight. Not importance, physical weight. News arrived folded, creased, smelling faintly of ink and hands that were not yours. You didn't skim it while doing something else. You sat down. You opened it. And for a few minutes, that was your entire relationship with the world. Headlines weren't optimized to hook you emotionally. They just existed. And because of that, nothing felt urgent unless it truly was. Wars began slowly in people's minds. Economic trouble crept in quietly. There was time to absorb bad news before the next bad thing arrived. Before modern life, waiting was not dead time. It was just time. You waited for mail. You waited for pay. You waited for answers. And while waiting, you lived. You talked. You worked. You noticed things. Nobody stood frozen in a state of anxious refresh. Before modern life, anticipation had space to stretch. Too much space sometimes. Courtship took months. Decisions took weeks. Change took years. This didn't make people wiser. It just gave consequences time to mature. Mistakes weren't instantly buried under new distractions. They aged. They followed you.
Before modern life, Americans understood delay as part of reality. If something broke, it stayed broken for a while. If someone was sick, they stayed sick longer. There was no overnight fix culture. And strangely, this made disappointment less sharp. You expected friction. Before modern life, sound meant something. When something made noise, it demanded attention. A knock on the door wasn't background audio, it was an event. A ringing phone stopped conversations mid-sentence. Silence returned when the sound ended. Nothing lingered. Today, sound follows us like fog. Back then, it visited. Before modern life, the home was not optimized. It was functional, sometimes barely. Houses were colder, darker, less forgiving. You adjusted yourself to the space. The space did not adjust to you. Comfort was earned. Before modern life, Americans were deeply aware of labor. You saw how things were made, who made them. Objects had stories. Repairs were normal. Throwing something away felt wasteful because replacement was not immediate. This built a quiet respect for durability. Before modern life, leisure was structured. You had time off, but it came with expectations. Church, family visits, community events. You didn't opt out easily. And because of that, shared culture stayed intact longer. Before modern life, conformity was not subtle. You dressed like others, spoke like others, behaved like others. Standing out required effort and consequences, so most people didn't. Individualism existed, but it was quieter. Before modern life, Americans lived closer to their limits. Financial limits, physical limits, emotional limits. There was less illusion of control. You planned, but you didn't assume success. Before modern life, authority figures aged in place. The same teacher for years, the same doctor, the same store owner. Trust accumulated slowly, and when trust broke, it was personal. Before modern life, children overheard adult life constantly. There were no content filters, no separate spaces. Kids absorbed worry, grief, and frustration early, which made them more resilient and sometimes more anxious. Before modern life, fear existed without amplification. People feared real things, local things. There was no ambient dread piped in from everywhere at once. Fear was specific. Before modern life, boredom sharpened imagination. With nothing to consume, people created stories, games, explanations, not always accurate ones. Before modern life, myths thrived quietly. Before modern life, life felt heavier but narrower. You carried fewer identities, fewer opinions, fewer expectations of yourself. You were a person in a place, doing what was necessary. And that simplicity, while restrictive, softened existential anxiety. You didn't ask if life had meaning, you asked what needed doing today. Before modern life, nights closed the day cleanly. No loose ends scrolling in your pocket. Just sleep, real sleep, and tomorrow waited patiently. But that patience was thinning, because America was learning speed. And once speed enters a culture, it never really leaves.
Part 4. When speed started winning quietly. At first, speed didn't announce itself. It crept in politely. A little faster mail, a little faster travel, a little less waiting, and Americans welcomed it. Of course they did. Why wouldn't you want things sooner? Before modern life fully tipped over, technology still felt like help, not obligation, a tool, not a tether.
Electric lights stretched the day just a bit longer, not forever, just longer than sunset. People still slept when they were tired, they just did more before that happened. Before modern life, convenience was a novelty, something to be appreciated, not expected. You didn't get angry when things were slow, you were grateful when they weren't. That mindset mattered, because the real shift wasn't machines, it was expectation. Before modern life, Americans expected delay. Now, delay began to feel like failure. If something could be faster, why wasn't it? And that question quietly rearranged everything. Workdays stretched, not dramatically, just a little. Productivity became a virtue. Busyness became proof of worth. Rest started to feel suspicious. Before modern life, exhaustion was physical, muscles, bones. Now it became mental, diffuse, harder to explain. People felt tired even when they hadn't done much. Before modern life, evenings meant separation. Work ended, home began. Now work followed people home in smaller, subtler ways. Paperwork, planning, worry. The mind stayed on longer than the body. Before modern life, Americans complained about life to each other. Now they began complaining internally. There was less space to process things out loud, more pressure to keep up quietly. Before modern life, community enforced limits. If you worked too much, people noticed. If you neglected family, people commented. Now boundaries softened. Success excused absence. Before modern life, ambition had edges. There were only so many hours, only so much reach. Now, ambition expanded with technology. You could want more, do more, chase further, and so people did. Before modern life, Americans compared themselves locally. Now, comparison widened. You weren't just measuring yourself against neighbors, you were measuring against ideals, abstract ones. Before modern life, failure was visible. Everyone saw it, and then life went on. Now, failure became internalized. If you didn't succeed, it felt personal, like you missed something. Before modern life, memory was external. Photos were rare. Stories carried meaning. Now, memory multiplied. Moments were documented, preserved, and suddenly the past became louder. Before modern life, mistakes faded naturally. Now they lingered. Before modern life, Americans moved their bodies more than their thoughts. Now thoughts raced while bodies stayed still. This imbalance crept into health, mood, and sleep. Before modern life, anxiety had reasons. Now it had ambiance, a background hum of unfinished things. Before modern life, people aged into roles. Now roles shifted constantly. Reinvention became possible and expected. Before modern life, identity was inherited. Now it was constructed, which sounds freeing and is, but it's also exhausting. Before modern life, the future felt distant. Now it leaned in close. Deadlines multiplied, plans stacked, the present shrank. Before modern life, Americans lived in cycles. Now they lived in momentum, and momentum doesn't rest. Before modern life, nights were for recovery. Now nights were for catching up. Sleep shortened, mind stayed active. Before modern life, silence meant nothing was happening. Now silence felt like something was missing. Before modern life, boredom was neutral. Now it felt intolerable. Before modern life, life moved at human pace. Now humans adjusted themselves to systems, quietly, gradually, without noticing how much had changed. No single moment marked the shift. No alarm went off. America didn't wake up modern. It drifted there. And by the time it noticed the speed, slowing down felt impossible. Still, remnants remained. Old habits, old expectations, a tug towards something calmer. And people felt it, even if they couldn't name it. A vague nostalgia, Not for the past exactly, but for a tempo that didn't demand so much. And that feeling, that low-grade longing, would only grow stronger as modern life finished settling in.
Part 5. When everything became available all the time. Before modern life fully closed the door behind it, America crossed a quiet threshold: availability. Things were no longer just possible, they were reachable, often, quickly. And once something becomes available, the human brain immediately assumes it should stay that way. Before modern life, scarcity structured behavior. You ate what was in season. You wore things until they wore out. You waited for moments instead of manufacturing them. Now, abundance crept in gently. Stores filled shelves, choices multiplied, and suddenly, wanting became a constant background process. Before modern life, desire was specific. You wanted a thing. Then you either got it or you didn't. Now, desire became ambient. You wanted better, newer, more efficient. And because those things existed somewhere, dissatisfaction grew faster. Before modern life, entertainment had edges. It started, it ended. Now it looped. You could always watch one more thing, listen to one more voice, consume one more distraction, and stopping required effort. Before modern life, information slept when you did. Now it didn't. The world stayed awake, which meant anxiety did too. Before modern life, America rested in gaps, between tasks, between seasons. Now gaps filled themselves. Waiting rooms gained televisions, silence gained noise, and eventually boredom lost its last hiding places. Before modern life, attention was durable. You gave it to one thing at a time. Now, attention fractured, split across tasks, thoughts, possibilities. And while this felt productive, it quietly thinned experience. Before modern life, Americans felt tired after effort. Now they felt tired after exposure. So much input, so little processing. Before modern life, opinions formed slowly. You thought, you discussed, you reconsidered. Now opinions arrived prepackaged, ready to adopt. Before modern life, disagreement was interpersonal. Now it became abstract. You argued with ideas, with headlines, not always with people. Before modern life, identity had friction. You grew into it. Now identity could be assembled, selected, edited, and constantly revised, which sounds empowering, but also destabilizing. Before modern life, Americans lived mostly where their bodies were. Now minds traveled constantly, to news, to arguments, to imagined futures. The present became harder to inhabit. Before modern life, success was visible. Now it became comparative, measured against unreachable standards. Before modern life, shame had limits. Now it's scaled. Before modern life, private life stayed private. Now boundaries blurred. Everything could be shared, nothing had to be. And navigating that choice became another task. Before modern life, mistakes faded. Now they were archived. Before modern life, loneliness came from isolation. Now it came from saturation. Too many connections, too little closeness. Before modern life, Americans expected relief after work. Now work followed them invisibly. Before modern life, life had a rhythm. Now it had a feed, always updating, always asking for attention. And through all of this, people adapted. Humans always do. Quietly, uneasily, still carrying instincts shaped for slower worlds, still craving pauses they could no longer name. And somewhere under all that availability, under all that choice,
was a growing sense that something essential had been traded away, not intentionally, not maliciously, just gradually. And that trade-off, that feeling of being perpetually on, would eventually define what modern life felt like. Which brings us to the quiet realization America didn't notice at first, that having everything all the time meant never fully leaving anything behind.
Part 6 and last part. When America forgot how to fully stop. At some point, without ceremony, America lost the off switch. Not in a dramatic way. No single invention to blame. No villain twirling wires in the background. It just stopped stopping. Before modern life, days ended cleanly. Work ended. Places closed. People went home. Now endings blurred. Stores stayed open. Lights stayed on. Information stayed flowing. And slowly the idea of enough began to dissolve. Before modern life, exhaustion signaled rest. Now exhaustion became background noise. People learned to operate while tired, to think while depleted, to live while slightly overwhelmed. And because everyone did it, it felt normal. Before modern life, Americans had fewer choices, but more commitment to the ones they made. Now choices multiplied, and commitment weakened. There was always something else you could be doing, watching, improving, becoming, so being present felt inefficient. Before modern life, attention settled. Now it hopped, from thought to thought, from worry to possibility, and the mind rarely landed long enough to rest. Before modern life, America dreamed in chunks. Plans had horizons. Now dreams fragmented, goals stacked, timelines overlapped, and the future pressed constantly against the present. Before modern life, people aged with their years. Now aging felt negotiable, delayable, optimizable, which made time feel adversarial instead of shared. Before modern life, memory softened the past. Now it replayed it. Mistakes stayed vivid, regrets stayed sharp. Before modern life, nostalgia arrived later in life. Now it showed up early, for moments that had barely ended. Before modern life, America measured progress by stability. Now it measured progress by acceleration. Faster was better, bigger was success, and slowing down felt like falling behind. Before modern life, people believed rest was earned. Now rest felt undeserved, something you justified, something you postponed. Before modern life, quiet felt natural. Now quiet felt empty, something to fill. Before modern life, America lived inside its days. Now it hovered above them, planning, comparing, optimizing. And that hovering created distance, distance from the body, distance from the moment. Before modern life, time passed. Now it rushed, and people chased it, even though it never slowed down to meet them. Yet despite all this, something old remains, a pull toward stillness, toward mornings with no agenda, toward evenings without screens, toward moments that feel complete without being shared. That pull is not nostalgia for hardship or for inconvenience. It's nostalgia for containment, for a life with edges, with pauses, with silence that doesn't ask anything of you. America before modern life wasn't better. It was harder, colder, more limited, but it knew when the day was done. And sometimes, late at night, modern America feels that absence in the quiet seconds before sleep, when nothing is playing, when nothing is loading, just the faint awareness that rest used to arrive more easily. And maybe that's why these stories feel soothing. Not because the past was kind, but because it moved slowly enough to be held. So if you're drifting off now, that makes sense. You're not going backward. You're just touching a tempo your body remembers. A world where life didn't rush you forward, but waited, patiently, for you to arrive.